It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
If you don't do this, then the future is one in which we're going to be poorer.
A call to embrace artificial intelligence from Labour's last general election winner. Keir Starmer makes his debut as Prime Minister on the world stage, heading to Washington later for a NATO summit. Does the threat from Russia mean more money is needed for defence? Mayors from across England pose in Downing Street as the government buries levelling up.
Levelling up was only ever a slogan. It wasn't a thing that people felt in their communities. The British public have had enough of politicians making promises that they don't follow through.
And after Conservative defeat last week, who can revive the party's fortunes? Potential leadership contenders line up.
Rishi Sunak, installed by MPs, led us to our greatest defeat, robbing members of their right, of their voice, of their say. It cannot be allowed to happen again.
Joining me to discuss all that, Work and Pensions Minister Alison McGovern, Conservative MP Danny Kruger, Lara Spirit from The Times and columnist for the iPaper Andrew Fisher. This is Politics Live. Welcome. Let's start with this from a UK government tweet on Friday, the 5th of July. You can see here the Right Honourable Angela Rayner MP, Deputy Prime Minister and Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. But what a difference a weekend can make, as Angela Rayner has posted this today. A government of public service means fixing the fundamentals to deliver for the British people. No more gimmicks and slogans, but the hard yards of governing in the national interest. The department I lead will be the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. So starting with you, Alison, is levelling up dead and buried?
The slogan. Because I think Jim said it very well in the intro there. People are sick of slogans that never deliver anything. You know, I'm long in the tooth enough to remember the Northern Powerhouse that definitely didn't power up the North. So we've got to focus on the doing. And, you know, that means the plan for growth. It means the plan to get our public services back on their feet. So personally, I think it's better to have the name of the department being what it does, and let's just drop the slogans.
Is it dead and buried, Danny?
Well, it looks like it. I mean, I look forward to Labour governing without any soundbites. That would be tremendous news for us all. But the principle of levelling up was the right one. There was a great injustice in our economy, historically, going back many, many decades. And the mission of levelling up was to spread opportunity everywhere. I hope Labour is committed to doing that. And there was progress made in the last 5 years. I hope they're not chucking out all the good stuff that's been done hitherto.
Right. I mean, was it just a slogan, though?
Well, no, it was very much more than a slogan. There was a whole range of commitments around funding, but also around devolution and around industrial strategy, around investment in our infrastructure and in productivity. So that plan, which I do think is cross-party, Alison, genuinely, we all want to level up the North and the Midlands.
Sure, but I come from an area that needed to be levelled up. We had more posters around Merseyside with the slogan levelling up than we had actually completed projects. I mean, I don't doubt that there was small pockets of capital investment, 20 million here and there. That was welcome, but it took so long to deliver anything. Meanwhile, all we had, I'll say, was these posters going up all around Merseyside saying, you are being levelled up. Well, actually, we had more obvious, people needing to go to food banks than we did have actually good projects delivered. Now, where we've got those projects underway, we all want to see them completed, and we can have a bit of cross-party support on that. I think that doesn't answer the fundamental question of what's gone wrong with our economy. Yeah. That means that some parts of our economy are growing fast but haven't been able to capitalise on that because of the unbalanced way in which our economy is run.
Absolutely, which goes back many, many decades.
Right, what about the removing of levelling up in that rather stark way? Is it dead and buried?
It's such a fascinating decision, in part because if you read the Levelling Up white paper that the former government put out in 2022, you'll find many similarities with the Gordon Brown report that we saw on devolution. There is a consensus, I think, from the main parties on over-centralisation and what needs to be happened. There is also probably a consensus that they don't want to spend the tens and tens of billions that would actually probably be needed if you were going to properly do this. But I do think it's a fascinating decision. One of the reasons it's fascinating as well is because it is very hard in politics to get a slogan slogan to fix, and it is very hard to get a slogan that is popular. We know that Boris Johnson did well in the 2019 election, not just with Get Brexit Done, but also with that promise of levelling up. And so I think it's surprising, given its popularity in some ways.
People understand it, don't they, Alison?
Can I just come back very briefly on that? The reason why, though, there's similarities is because the data is the same between the Brown Review and also the Levelling Up White Paper. The difference is the policies. And that's why if you look at the structural investment we want to put in to change our energy mix and the money that's reserved within that for jobs, it's precisely those areas that were deindustrialised in the past that need a whole new economic plan. And that is the difference between us. The data is the same, the position is the same, but the policies are different.
Right. I mean, will it make any difference, though, to the delivery that Alison is talking about, removing, levelling up? A slogan, yes, but one that people did understand what it meant.
They did understand what it meant. The problem is they also understood that it didn't happen.
Well,
the slogan went in, but nothing actually got levelled up. Look, if you wanted to level up Britain in terms of capital investment,
you'd have to spend or invest.
It was a 1.7 billion fund, the Levelling Up Fund. You'd have to spend £30 billion to level up the rest of England to the level of London, let alone Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland as well. So it is not, in terms of capital investment, in terms of council funding, the councils today around the country are getting £15 billion less than they were in 2010, hence why councils are collapsing, going bankrupt, they're cutting their services, they're closing libraries. So this idea of levelling up was a great idea, it was just never backed up by any funds. It was a slogan, and getting rid of a slogan is fine, but they also need to put the capital in. So that onus is still on Labour to do that, and I hope they do. But I think they're right to get rid of gimmicks. I think
you do? You think it's the right idea?
I think it's right to get rid of the gimmick, yeah.
All right, well...
I think it's been disgraced in people's eyes because they saw it as an empty slogan.
A few days after Keir Starmer wins his historic landslide for Labour, the last Labour leader, as you saw there in the headlines, to do that, Tony Blair, has given Keir Starmer some advice around innovation and using technology to help government fix some of the fundamental problems in public services. Let's have a listen.
The innovation is not going to happen in government. The innovation is going to happen outside of government. It's government that should apply the innovation. And if you like, with the health service, one of the reasons why when I was in government we introduced tuition fees, and I know it wasn't a popular thing to do, but I could see at the turn of the century how universities were going to stop being simply places of learning and become an economic engine of innovation. Right. If you look at the health service today, that again, look at it not simply as a service to the public, but look at it as generating, because it's one national service, the data that can allow you to boost your life sciences and treat people in a much more effective way.
And certainly the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, is listening because he's attending the conference that's being hosted by the Tony Blair Institute. You can see him there with John Sopel, who is chairing the event. And we will try and turn around part of what he says a little later on in the programme. But the broad thrust of what Tony Blair was talking about, Alison, is AI the answer to lessening the tax burden in terms of funding the health service in the future?
Well, using new technology has got to be a part of it, and I think we're all fed up of the days of getting, a letter through the post after the appointment has been scheduled. So I think it's glaringly obvious that the NHS needs to move on in terms of technology. As part of our first steps, we want to have slightly more basic forms of technology like scanners. We need more diagnostic tools. But the point about the AI and so on is that there's lots of ways in which some of the customer service elements of public services can be improved, which will free up the staff that we have in our public services to do that person-to-person care that only a human can do.
But is it the answer to fixing the NHS rather than higher taxes?
I think reform will help, yes. I mean, my answer to that would be it is an important part of it because you've got to use the technology that's available to make sure that our public services are as efficient as they can be. I think in my own area of DWP, where through universal credit, if we can offer people a better access to it, better customer service, as I say, we can free up the people to do the care that only a person can do with another person.
Andrew, do you agree? Some of the figures that were put out by the chief economist at the Tony Blair Institute forecast that taxes would have to go up by 1.9 percentage points of GDP by the end of the Parliament to stabilise debt, talking about £53 billion. Can that be avoided by AI?
No, of course not. Look, people are getting older and they're living longer in old age. We are going to spend more on the NHS and social care. That's unavoidable. And anyone selling any kind of snake oil, especially Tony Blair, and I'm sure his corporate sponsors, thank you for promoting his little conference, are just telling lies. You know, of course, technology moves on in the NHS. I mean, I have to say to Alison, I had an NHS appointment this morning. I got a text reminding me this morning to come to it. I had an email, the day before. It doesn't just work on letters and posts. We shouldn't do it down.
No, you make a fair point.
But
we have areas of really good practice.
There's areas of reform, of course.
And areas
if you look
that
at how cancer's being treated today versus 20 or 30 years ago, and the survival rates as well, we should be good at that, even though there are delays and they're costing people's lives. Technology has always moved on. This isn't anything revelatory, and I think trying to latch onto this and say AI like it's the most modern thing he can hop on is a bit tedious, really. Look, taxes are going to have to go up, or we're going to get a worse health service. There's no way around that, and any politician who tells you different, I'm afraid, isn't telling the truth.
Do you agree with Andrew or Tony Blair?
Well, probably more with Blair, because I do think there are huge gains that can be made in the public sector through productivity improvements that technology can help with.
And the previous Conservative governments couldn't do it.
Well, actually they did, and there have been significant improvements. And just recently, there was a £4 billion commitment to invest in technology, including AI, that's now gone into the health budget. I fear it's going to be taken to pay for the doctors' pay rise that they're going to offer. But we hope that will happen. But no, but there's Andrew's absolutely right that our increasing demand for healthcare requires a model that works for everybody. Part of that is going to be funding. There has been significant funding over the last 14 years in funding, 25% increase in the health budget. It's escaped from austerity. But in future, we're going to have a system that works, that is going to be fundamentally more human. So I'm more interested in the devolution of the health service, empowering the front line, making sure that local managers can look after their budgets properly, rather than constantly pouring more and more money into the top of this bureaucracy, which sucks up resources and responsibility from the front line.
Laura, what did you make of Tony Blair's intervention? Andrew dismisses it as a little conference, but there's the Shadow Health Secretary attending, listening, because he's talked about not more money over and above what's already committed, but reform.
It's a really interesting example of where there is not a consensus in Labour, I think it's important to say. You have seen Tony Blair make this intervention today, but I've spoken to a number of people in Labour who do have concerns about AI, and they have concerns about these kinds of interventions for two reasons. They say, first of all, it displaces conversation around the risks of generative AI, which, while Tony Blair agrees with them, thinks that this might be a distraction from that conversation. And secondly, it distracts from the conversation around NHS provision and services. Yes, AI could have fantastic opportunities for, say, diagnostics, for example, but if the services aren't there to treat them, they say, then we have a big problem. And they worry that this could be a distraction in that way.
And that means that taxes will have to go up, probably in a first term.
Well, we've identified where we can get resources for the NHS.
Very small. Important, but very small in terms of the NHS budget.
Let's do the first steps first. Let's get on with it. We said some things in the election that we wanted to do, and we've got to focus on getting on with those things. And that does mean dealing with the loophole in the non-DOMS tax arrangements situation and getting that money for our NHS. It means getting 2 million more appointments and so on. But in the broad thrust of this conversation, what we want to have is really excellent treatment pathways so that we can continue to improve, our cancer outcomes and other things. I know we're better, but we still have pockets of really bad health inequality, really bad health. So we need to focus on improving the whole of that pathway. That does mean using technology and, as I keep saying, freeing up the people to do what only people can do. But I think it's a whole package that goes together.
Well, while we're talking about spending or not, as you mentioned, the junior doctors' strike, that is an immediate demand, of course, on the new Health Secretary, the issue of the striking junior doctors and their pay demands. Let's just have a listen to what Wes Streeting has said.
Are you optimistic? Optimistic, yes. Look, this is an important reset moment, I think, in the relationship between junior doctors and their government. And in opposition, we were very clear that the headline 35% pay demand is not one that we could afford, and that has not changed since the general election. The reason we were so blunt in opposition wasn't simply about delivering a tough message, but about showing them the respect I think they are due. And a key ingredient of respect is honesty.
Andrew, should Wes Streeting just cough up and pay the doctors?
Look, I think the junior doctors dispute, we shouldn't forget, has been settled in Scotland, it's been settled in Wales, and the government, which covers the NHS for England, hasn't settled it in over a year.
Yes.
It's dragged on and on and on. So if Wales have found a solution to it, and Scotland under the SNP, Wales under Labour have found solutions to it, there is no reason why Wes Streeting shouldn't. The junior doctors' pay demand for 35% isn't necessarily 35% tomorrow on day
it's
one.
pay restoration
It's about
over
pay
time.
restoration
But that's
because-
still, but the cost of that would be enormous.
2010, that was their pay. The NHS coped with that, and it did all the way through. So to say it's unaffordable, well, we afforded it in 2010 in real terms. So it's ridiculous to say it's unaffordable. Of course it's affordable.
Is it
It costs
affordable?
about an extra £1 billion. It's very small money on real money. But if you said to the junior doctors, look, we're not going to do it tomorrow, but by the end of the Parliament you'll be back there, and here's a pathway to do it, I think you could settle it fairly
Is it affordable?
Well, we've had 14 years of Tory government since 2010, unfortunately, so the economy is arguably in an even worse position than we were after the financial crash. You know,
Well,
Wes will...
we're gonna have that discussion.
It's a lot better.
I profoundly disagree with that point.
does the
Wes
data.
is rolling his sleeves up and getting on with it. It's not just about pay, of course, important though pay is. It's also about the kind of ways in which people are expected to work. I know how stressed people working in our NHS have been. Actually, as much as anything, it's about stopping people leaving the NHS, making sure that people feel valued, that their shift patterns are supporting good mental and physical health. So there's a whole package of things that we need to do to rescue the NHS. Wes is rolling his sleeves up and getting on with it. I think that's the right thing to do.
Well,
We'll find a way through.
I will come back to you, Danny, in just a moment, because as Alison mentioned that line, it was a sort of echo of what Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, said yesterday, that Labour have inherited, or it's a worse inheritance than 2010. Let's have a listen to what she said yesterday.
Let me address the inheritance. I have repeatedly warned that whoever won the general election would inherit the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. What I have seen in the past 72 hours has only confirmed that.
Danny, is it the worst inheritance since the Second World War?
Well, let me just take a moment not to play politics and to acknowledge, as I think we both did earlier, that we have an economic model that doesn't work for this country, and it goes back some decades. And we can discuss why that is, and it's about the profound technological changes that have happened. And I regret more wasn't done in the last 14 years, with all the economic crises, including the one we inherited, to deal with, that we haven't dealt with that. Nevertheless, the suggestion that we are in a worse state than 2010, in 2010, we were spending a tenth of our national income on debt repayments because of the excessive borrowing that Labour had done. And the financial crash essentially ruined the public finances. It took 10 years to get borrowing back under control, during which time wages increased, employment increased, and the economy began to rebalance. Then we went into COVID. So, yes, the economy is very, very precarious. The model, the fundamental model is essentially broken, and we've had recent difficulties. But what Rachel is saying now is also, I'm afraid to say, dishonest. She knew what the public finances looked like before she came in. She admitted that. The idea that she's just discovered this.
Well, we'll come on to that. But what do you say to Danny? What do you say to Danny's...
of what Rachel said? She didn't say that she didn't know. She said she can confirm all of the things that she said again and again and again.
But what about Danny's assessment of the economy and the inheritance they got in 2010? Do you not agree?
No, I don't agree. I think of the debt level. I mean, forgive me not having the figures, right off the top of my head. But what's debt to GDP now? Pushing at 100%. It's much higher than it was then. Then you look at the state of our NHS, our schools. I think of the employment level that was growing. The trend was growing steadily. It fell during the pandemic. It's absolutely plateaued. All of the things, all of the back to work policies that Rishi Sunak used to proclaim. What happened? The labour supply is forecast to be absolutely flat, and that's the biggest barrier that we have to growth in our country. Businesses crying out for staff, people turning up at food banks. The economy has been broken, I'm afraid, over the past 14 years. That combination of austerity, bad Brexit deal and political chaos has done a huge damage. And I don't think it's a tenable position to say that it was worse in 2010.
Danny?
It just was not.
Well, listen, we can argue about 2010, but the fact is the public finances were absolutely ruined in 2010, and it took 10 years to restore them. And then we went into COVID. We went into COVID, and we have had a very, very difficult few years. And by the way, I accept the points about the political turmoil. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It's been very difficult. I don't think that accounts for our economic difficulties, which are
drives the failure of investment. Because people can't rely. A business can't rely. If I invest in this thing today because of what the government policy is, people didn't know that was going to be the government policy in 3 weeks' time. That was the problem.
The whole world was derailed by COVID, including the politics of the UK. And I recognise...
And the UK was derailed by the Tory party.
Well, I'm afraid you can't say that. The problem was, because of COVID and because of the inflation shock, because of Ukraine, across the West, we've had political crises because of that, including in our major allies. So it is not a UK-specific problem. But there's a lot to do, I recognise, and you have a huge challenge ahead of you.
Laura, who's right on this?
Well, much of this is about setting the terms of the inheritance. And for a long time, people have known that Rachel Reeves would want to come in and be able to say, given that she's going to have this big fiscal event later in the year, given that we know, implied cuts to areas like prisons, for example, very few people think are actually plausible given the news we've seen this week. She wants to be able to say things are absolutely terrible and the decisions that I've made have been made absolutely necessarily as a result of Conservative failings, and that is what you were saying. That's why she chose her first big set-piece event to make that very clear. And I'm sure that the Conservatives and Labour will fight over that in the coming days because it will be vital to how people view what Labour does next.
I mean, don't all new governments do this? Don't they always highlight the deficiencies, the inheritance of the ones before? It was helped, of course, for the coalition government by the note that was left. It was a sort of visible symbol, if you like. There's no money left. Liam Byrne, yes, the former Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
If you look at the reality of where we are today, we have social care in crisis, we have a housing crisis, there are more families in temporary accommodation than ever. NHS waiting lists are 3 times higher, more than 3 times higher than they were in 2010. Social care's in a worse state, there's a bigger backlog in the courts.
But COVID has exacerbated that, hasn't it, Andrew? Even if these things... I was talking about the NHS and social care.
But even before COVID, at the end of 2019, at the last but one general election now, NHS waiting lists were 4.5 million. So they've gone up by over 2 million between 2010 and 2019. So the idea public services were working well and had been repaired, sorry, just not true. They were being wrecked by austerity. And look, we've got the evidence in front of us. People's living standards are down. More people using food banks than ever. We are in a terrible state. There's destitution went up by 150% since 2017. That is a terrible, damning indictment on our economy and people's living standards.
So I think we should give the new government the benefit of the doubt and wish them well in this huge challenge that they have. I've mentioned the deep structural problems in our economy. There's also deep structural problems in our public services, and I regret we didn't do more to fix them. I don't think it's simply a case of pouring more money in, because money was poured in and it didn't fix. The challenge is my anxiety about this new government, who promised change and make a great deal about turning the page. They are unfortunately wedded to the status quo. They are committed, as we've heard from Keir Starmer talking to civil servants, saying, I respect you and I want to work with you and you're right about everything. We're going to hear it from other...
I think he said you're right about everything.
Well, he wants to end the battle.
I think he said we'll treat each other with respect, which seems to me to be like the basics.
You're absolutely right, Alison. But the subtext of that is, and we know it from the appointment of his Chief of Staff and the appointments he's making generally, and the whole language of Labour is we want to get back to a period in which basically the civil service run the show. They are not committed to the reforms.
I don't think that's true at all. He's had all of the Metro mayors in today.
Everything they've done so far is all the stuff. For instance, the prison, if you allow me, just the prison reforms that they've announced, basically releasing loads of prisoners. The Tory ministers were holding back civil servants from doing that in recent months because they knew that that's what the system wanted. They knew that it's not what the public wanted, it's not what's right. You guys have come in, the civil servants have given you a plan, and you've said that's what we'll do.
Well, let Alison respond. Is it the status quo?
No, it's not the status quo. And on prisons, Keir has appointed somebody who is very definitely a reformer, James Simpson. So I think that's great. I'm sure that we will have a very different way forward. I'm thinking about what DWP ought to be doing to support people who've been in prison to move into a really good job. So I think it's definitely about reform. We were talking before about levelling up slogan. Actually, it's the policy that matters. It's about making sure that every place has a plan for economic growth, which will be very different, not just slogans, but actually real change in people's economy.
Yeah, well, now you've mentioned the mission for economic growth. Let me just show you this on the front page of the Daily Express, because, as you will know, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, one of a number of think tanks, were asking for more honesty about the state of public finances. So what's it to be? This is on the back of Rachel Reeves's speech, talking about that inheritance, confirming, you say, just how bad it is, tax rises or cuts to our services. Is Rachel Reeves softening up the population for what's to come by saying the inheritance is really as bad as I thought it was, even though, as many people would say, you could see the figures before the campaign started?
Yes, the book has been open for some time, which is a point made by Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who, of course, his organisation criticised that conspiracy of silence in both Conservative and Labour spending plans during the election. As I just said, I think setting the terms of the inheritance will be very important, and we'll see how they'll do that. One of the interesting things for Rachel Reeves to balance will be trying to say that the Tories have left her a very difficult economy, while also looking at inflation potentially coming down, as it has, to target Bank of England interest rate cuts, which we could expect in the coming months. And, of course, recently, albeit only edging over, a return to some growth. So whether or not she wants to champion those in the coming months, rhetorically, will be quite interesting when set opposed to this goal, which is clearly to persuade people that the Tories have left a big economic mess.
So is it tax rises or cuts to services, Alison?
Well, as in the election, the IFS have rightly set out the damage that 14 years of Conservative government have done to our country, and I respect their point of view. That's why we need the plan for growth that Rachel spoke about yesterday, so that we can change the fortunes. You know, I'm not going to bore everybody by setting out again the areas where we do want to bring in more revenue, because we do want to get more money into
Yes, and you're hoping
schools,
private
into the
investment
NHS.
is sort of broadly across the board is going to step in.
That's right.
take long.
We want to grow our economy so that we can get ourselves on a better footing. So I don't blame anyone for pointing out this is a difficult situation.
Sure.
That's why we
So
need
does that mean there'll be no surprises? No surprises, because, as you say, as we've agreed, I think the books were open. We could see the figures, and certainly the politicians could look at it. There'll be no surprises in the first few years of a Labour government.
Do you mean surprises in policy terms?
In terms of tax rises or cuts to spending, because you have promised not to do either.
Well, that in terms of our priorities, it's the first steps. I've set out before what those areas where we do want to bring more revenue in, and that we don't want to put increased taxes on working people.
I know you don't want to, but you might have to.
That means those commitments. Joe, we want to get on with the things we said in the election.
I know you do, but it is about the honesty with viewers.
I agree, and we've got a bigger problem. I spoke to hundreds and hundreds of people on doorsteps who were cynical about politics because they don't think politics can deliver. So we've got a simple job to do that will be very hard, which is to actually get on with the things that we said in the election.
No, getting on with it is fine. It's whether you will have to do one of those two things, or maybe both. I mean, you would have preferred spending cuts, wouldn't you, Danny?
Well, I would prefer reform, and I'd prefer growth, actually. And ultimately,
we all like growth.
Yeah. No, but, I mean, you're right to raise the cynicism of the electorate. They're going to get very cynical when they discover, as they already expect, that Labour, of course, will have to put up taxes, because they're not going to reform the system sufficiently, and they have a whole bunch of commitments they want to make. It wouldn't have taken long.
It's a fantastic crystal ball you've got there, Danny.
Well, it wouldn't have taken long for you to relay the ways you're going to increase revenue, Alison, because there's only two of them. You're going to clobber the non-doms and you're going to clobber private schools. There's no other way that you've already promised to make tax rises.
You've forgotten the private equity carried.
Okay, all right. We're talking about.
You haven't learned the manifesto. You haven't learned the manifesto completely, have you?
Well done. But if you allow me, what they've said they won't do is raise tax on working people, which means they will raise tax on people's private wealth. So if you've got a house of your own, if you've got any investments, if you've got pensions, Labour are coming for you.
That.
Of course they would.
No.
That's
you would.
got to happen.
Well, isn't that wealth taxes?
I think Danny quite cleverly elided people's homes with private wealth. Okay. Somebody owning their own home has not got masses of private wealth in most people's understanding. But if you've got multiple homes and you benefit through capital gains tax, why on earth should you pay a lower rate of tax than somebody who goes out and does a job for a living? Or if you trade art or shares or whatever, of course, I think there is a case for equalising capital gains tax with income tax. By the way, Nigel Lawson, Thatcher's Chancellor, did that. It's hardly a left-wing idea.
It was a little while ago.
It was in 1988, but he did it and it was a good thing. We should be looking at that. And I think there are a number of ways that don't clobber working people. Quite rightly, Labour has ruled out putting taxes up on working people. That's right, but there are other things you can do, like capital gains tax, like on inheritance tax, which was cut twice under the Tories, where you could put taxes up a bit and not clobber working people. And I think
advice worth heeding?
I'm not going to make up tax policy on the hoof, in the TV studio.
But do you agree broadly with what Andrew is saying in terms of where you can raise money by equalising capital gains to income tax?
We are getting ahead of ourselves. I want us to get on and do the things that we have said to people that we will do. That is the biggest priority now. We need to show that those simple things, those first steps that we said in the election, that we can do them.
Well, let's
where
talk
our
about
focus
some of
is.
those first steps, or one of them in particular, and that's on defence spending. Another key demand. In the Times, Starmer urged to raise defence spending on eve of NATO summit. The former head of the army says troop numbers and supplies are alarmingly low at a time when the world is more dangerous than at any point since 1945. And this is as Keir Starmer heads over to Washington for that NATO summit, and he'll meet the US President Joe Biden. But it is another spending demand. Should the Labour government very quickly put a date on getting to 2.5% of defence spending as a proportion of GDP?
Well, I think that we should try and do it as soon as we can. I'm not going to make it up. I'm not going to give you a date, because we want to do it as soon as we can. And I think that those comments that have been made are very reasonable, especially given, I think it was Ben Wallace, I think I'm right in saying, who said that the army had been hollowed out under the Conservative government. Actually, one of the main areas, again, similar to our other public servants, is about making sure that people have decent quality of life. You know, we know that there's, again, I think I'm right in saying there's significant underspends and issues in terms of people's housing for members of our armed forces.
Well, certainly a lot of very poor quality housing for them.
That's right. And, you know, I think those issues are really where we need to focus to make sure that we can keep people housed well and their families looked after. So I think that there's practical things that we can do.
But you won't commit to. But you don't think you should commit yet to a date which the former Conservative government said 2030.
I'm sure everybody would want it to happen as soon as possible. There are significant dangers in the world, and we need to make sure that we're investing in the things that will keep us safe.
Danny?
So quickly, because this should be a cross-party area of consensus, and actually to give them credit, Labour did support everything that the Conservative government did in terms of support for Ukraine, so I applaud that. On army accommodation, I represent more army families than any other MP, and there's been real improvement in the quality of accommodation in recent years. I regret they've abandoned the support for veterans that we were making, and they don't have a veterans minister anymore. But I do welcome the fact that they're making a commitment to get to 2.5%. But as Alison said about business investment, it takes time to make these sorts of spending commitments land on the front line, and particularly in defence. So it is vital that, and I really hope they do this. This is a good opportunity with Starmer going to NATO to make this pledge that we will get to 2.5% by 2030, so that everybody can start planning for that.
Although during the campaign, of course, the Conservatives attacked Keir Starmer and Labour for being sort of weak on security,
well, they have
for
been,
not
I'm
having.
afraid. I mean, because of this commitment, it was only at the last moment that they made a commitment to 2.5 at all. So I wish
When did you make the commitment of 2.5% by 2030? It was only earlier this year, I think.
We have increased spending on the defence by 25% in real terms since 2019. There have been major improvements in defence spending. We made the 2.5%.
That's only because it's been run down by quite a lot previous to that.
That is actually a totally legitimate accusation, and I recognise it. There were huge cuts that had to be made after 2010. Following on, I'm afraid, from the hollowing out in the public finances that we had to experience. So it is a shame, and I wish we'd got those quicker. But now Labour have to catch up with us and make this commitment so that we can start the planning, that the generals can start procuring the kit that they need and start recruiting the soldiers we need.
Right, well, the backdrop to this NATO summit, of course, is the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, and we can show you some pictures yesterday of deadly missile strikes in Kyiv, in the capital. It was one of the worst waves of missile strikes, and it hit a children's hospital, the major paediatric hospital in the capital, and you can see here, tragically, patients being carried out, wheeled out as a result of that attack. Should defence be a priority, Andrew?
Of course, we live in a very dangerous world, and I think the images we're watching show that, and I think we're right to put more money into supporting the Ukraine people's right to self-determination.
And increasing to 2.5% by 2030?
I actually don't think that's necessary. Look, we're on 2.3%, I think, roughly at the moment.
Yeah.
2.5%, this has become a sort of arbitrary... It was basically a gimmick by the Tory government to try and say to Labour,
it may be arbitrary, but actually I've just quoted the former head of the army, and he actually thinks it should be closer to 3%. I mean, I heard Radek Sikorski this morning saying Poland, obviously they're right up against Russia, spending 4%.
Well,
so when
we spent 5% in the Cold War.
Yeah, but we're not in the Cold War, and I would argue a lot of that spending wasn't well spent, and we ought to look actually at where if you look at the Ajax tanks, for example, that's been an absolute disaster in terms of procurement. A lot of the capital spending hasn't been well spent. If you look at Trident as well, I mean, I have to say that's a huge ongoing spending commitment, both in terms of capital and in terms of maintenance. And actually, you find a lot of ex-army generals saying, actually, we need more in conventional weapons, not in nuclear. That doesn't help us. So therefore, actually reallocating some of that spend would actually be a lot more effective, because we're talking about weapons we actually need to use to defend ourselves, not nuclear weapons, which are never going to be used.
Is there the mounting pressure? I mean, there is mounting pressure on Keir Starmer and the new Labour government to really focus on this issue in terms of spending. I know they're focused on it in terms of support, but in terms of spending, it's going to become a real priority, isn't it?
Yeah, I think some in Labour felt quite fortunate during the campaign when the priority the Conservatives had made of defence initially was slightly displaced by the D-Day gaffe that Sunak made, in the sense that perhaps it wasn't possible to major on it as an issue anymore. Now, he's now going to NATO. He will definitely be asked, especially given these words from senior military figures who are pressing him to do more, why it is that places like Estonia and Poland are shouldering a higher proportion of the burden than places like Britain, notwithstanding, of course, our support for Ukraine and elsewhere. And I think even though we're expecting this review, this is an area, of course, where the books aren't as open as in the economy, where Labour are going to come in and want to look at the specifics of what that defence industry looks like and what it needs. But I think coming up against these big trips where he'll be under pressure from other NATO members to be doing more will make it quite difficult for him, and I think does pressure him in terms of time.
Well, Keir Starmer, as I said, on his way to Washington for that appearance on the world stage. Been a different experience, of course, for outgoing Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, seen here leaving Downing Street with his wife on Friday morning after giving his speech there. He's appointed his shadow cabinet out of the 121 MPs left in the Conservative Party, and he said he will stay on as leader of the party until formal arrangements have been made for selecting his successor. Now, there are a number of potential leadership contenders, which isn't surprising, despite the fact that a few of them, of course, lost their seats. One of them is the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. She was speaking at a conference this morning held by the Popular Conservatism Movement on beginning the rebuild. Let's have a listen. She joined the conference by video link.
We were going to use our Brexit freedoms to stop the waves of illegal migrants landing on our shores. We were going to cut taxes. We were going to lower overall legal migration. We were going to stop the lunatic woke virus working its way through the British state. The harsh reality, this is the lesson we all need to learn and face up to, is that we did none of that.
Danny, you supported Suella Braverman for the leadership after Boris Johnson. Does she still have your support?
Well, let's wait and see who ends up standing. I think the important thing is that a period of humility on part of the Conservative Party would probably be welcome. And I think we need to take our time to understand what's just happened. We've just been completely wiped out. Frustratingly, not because Labour picked up any more votes than they ever do, but because half our vote disappeared,
They
collapsed.
picked up a few more.
Well, hardly. Their vote share didn't increase. So, no, but the fact is Labour didn't win this. We lost it because of our own stupidity.
Sorry.
So well done. You've won all these seats because under first past the post, that's the way it works.
Well,
but
exactly.
That is the system.
All congratulations to you.
Yeah.
I acknowledge it. I'm not going to challenge the election result. What I'm going to say is it happened because the Conservative Party's vote split.
and
Suella's essentially right in her analysis.
So you agree with her analysis?
So her analysis is right, that we didn't deliver for the people. I think it goes more broadly than some of those issues. It goes back to the conversation we were having earlier. We haven't, over the years we've been in power, fixed the fundamentals of the British state. And Brexit was the beginning, supposed to be, and it was a great big mandate from the public. Please, can you make the British government work for us? And because of lots of issues, of which many are our responsibility, others are just global events, that hasn't happened. So that is why we got rejected at the polls. That's why Reform are picking up all these votes. So what we need to do now is to spend, I hope, quite a long time. I don't want to rush into a leadership election.
Oh, you don't?
Trying to understand that. And then out of that, I hope a consensus will emerge about the future we need.
You agree with her analysis, Suella Braverman's analysis, so you haven't sort of ruled her out as someone that you might support in a...
So, like I say, I'm going to just not get into the
all right.
individuals.
But Lord Frost, former Brexit minister, in fact, has called for an interim leader. Perhaps like you, he thinks it's going to take time and that the Conservative Party should reflect. Would you be happy to see an interim leader to let Rishi Sunak go off into the sunset after the summer and perhaps at conference?
I think that might well work. I think we should not let the immediate need for somebody to stand at the dispatch box and oppose Keir Starmer, important as that is, determine the timetable of this. So if Rishi's happy to stay on and colleagues would like him to, That's one option, or maybe we can anoint some caretaker leader. But the important thing is we don't rush, which I think is a mistake we've made before. And we make it all about the individual, and we get into these psychodramas. Actually, what's needed is a proper analysis, and to remember what conservatism is and reconnect with our voters.
Right. I mean, I suppose not all Conservatives agree, like all parties. I mean, Suella Braverman also said that Nigel Farage, who is now a member of Parliament for Reform, should be part of the Conservative Party. That would be a way of neutralising the effect and the rise of Reform UK. Do you agree?
No, I don't think he should be, not least because he doesn't want to be, and he's just stood against us, and his party has attempted to replace us. So no, I don't think we can accommodate Nigel himself, although all honour to him for his achievements. But what we do need to do is to win back, or to win over, the people who've backed him this time. And that's by putting out a coherent and genuinely Conservative message that recognises the challenges that this country is in, that is forward-looking, and that brings together the whole Conservative family, including many of those people who've deserted us this time.
Right. I mean, if you are not sure about Suella Braverman anymore in the way that you perhaps were, is there anybody else that you like the look of?
Well, there's a bunch of people who are being touted. Nobody has, publicly declared themselves, but it's fairly plain. Some of the people who are putting themselves forward, they're all good, actually. I respect, so Tom Tugendhat, Kemi Badenoch, Rob Jenrick. There's some very decent, I think, very capable potential leaders who are stepping forward, and what I hope is that we can have a collegiate conversation among us all about what's gone wrong and what we need, because ultimately we all, we hope, going to end up serving together and opposing this massive Labour majority which we've gone and given them.
Suella Braverman at that conference there, beamed live by video link. Your thoughts on what she was saying and her analysis of what went wrong for the Conservatives and what it means for the contest?
Well, on the analysis, I think it's important to say that the Conservatives did lose vote to Labour in seats where Labour needed to win. That's a fundamental thing that I think some people have missed in this analysis. And yes, I think the Reform vote made a very bad situation catastrophic for the Conservative Party, but both of the pieces of that electoral geography for the Conservative Party are important to rebuild. And when I listened to Suella Braverman say what she said, in particular an attack on Liberal Conservatives that it was, they were specifically to blame. It is actually quite difficult for me to see her running in circumstances where she says those things, because if you look at those Conservative MPs who have survived, the 121 Conservative MPs there are, actually there are a number of 25 new MPs in that flank, but they are actually pretty centrist. They're actually pretty centre-right. And yes, some of their leading members have lost their seats, but that is also true of the right of the party. Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think, chief among them. And it's not the case, I think, when you listen to what Suella Braverman is saying, that it's possible to see how a candidate like her would necessarily be deemed quite popular. Now, yes, the important thing to note is that the membership is vital here, and if you can get a candidate to the final two as the right of the party, fine.
But Laura's right in terms of the number of MPs who sit in the sort of centre,
so what I think
rather
we need,
than perhaps your wing of the party.
I mean, I think Rob Jenrick is making a very good argument, actually, which is that what we need is we do need to bring the two wings together. There are some people who will probably never be satisfied with the sort of centre-right agenda, kind of full-on left-wing Conservatives, but there's not many of them. Most people are either on the right or in the centre, and what they want, I think, is a coherent, genuinely Conservative message, particularly around migration, by the way, but also one that is responsible and serious and sober and is able to reach out and to bring back some of those voters. Yes, a few have left us for Labour, but hardly any. The great problem was the shift to Reform and to stay at home, and those are the ones we need to win back.
So it does sound like the former Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, could be a standout candidate for you because he's putting migration at the heart of the debate.
Well, I think it is fundamentally that and potholes was the issue that came up, and they're both symbols of state failure. And I think migration really speaks to both the economic challenge we have. Why do we have low productivity? Why do we have all these problems in public services? Partly it's because of population growth. Also to our cultural challenges. So I think migration should be centre in this debate.
Who should lead the 1922 backbench committee?
I don't know. They're all great.
Oh, that's a right get out of jail card.
I think
they're all great.
I think they are. I think
all two of them.
Exactly.
I was going to say, but
I'm
anyway.
not sure who's running, but I like them all.
On immigration, just very briefly, Tony Blair said that this Labour government will have to do something about immigration to stop populism on the right.
No, I don't think it does. I think you have to stand up to populism, and I think there's a message from France here. Actually, is that you've seen Macron kind of pander to
it's divided.
He got lost, and actually it was the left that rose, that took it on head on. Look, the Conservatives have done everything over the last 15 years to increase immigration. They've cut NHS training places. They've made universities more reliant on foreign students. They've cut wages in social care and left massive vacancies. So they've done everything to keep immigration high.
And Labour should keep it high too.
Well, look, unless you want gaps in social care, unless you want the NHS collapsing, unless you want the universities going bankrupt, you have to, actually.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back with more Politics Live at 12:15 here tomorrow on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Is PMQs on tomorrow then? Or no? Is it still shut until next week? Fuck knows. Probably is. Because, yeah, because we don't have a King's Speech, do we? Next week, PMQs. Would it be tomorrow? But no, it's hard. Because they haven't fucking opened it yet, have they? No. I can't wait for the new PMQs, man. It's going to be great. I know people don't like Nigel Farage. But it's going to be entertaining, to say the least. Oh, yeah. Anyway, hope you all have a lovely day. I'll be back tomorrow. See, I'm streaming a bit more now. That's actually interesting again. A bit bored on it before. Same old fucking same old. But anywho, enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye, people.